a presentation I gave on solar power for ham radio. That's next on this episode of Ham Radio Q&A. Hi, I'm Michael, KB9VBR, your host for Ham Radio Q&A. I'm on a mission to inspire and educate the amateur radio community. If things like that interest you, be sure to hit like and subscribe. Also, check us out on Patreon. Patrons help keep the mission alive. That's over at patreon.com/KB9VBR Antennas. Well, recently, at our local amateur radio club, I gave a presentation on solar power for ham radio. And basically, this was sort of an introductory type presentation of the concepts and the equipment that you would need to put together a basic solar power system for your amateur station, whether it's something for portable solar power or if you're thinking of more of a home system. The impetus for this presentation really is right behind me here. The time and the effort I put into putting a solar system in the back of my trailer. Without any further ado, let's get into my presentation on solar power for amateur radio. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about solar power for ham radio, and basically I think this presentation is more of like a 10,000 foot view of solar power, maybe just to kind of give you an idea of directions you need to go if you want to put solar power, say in your camper, in your trailer, or just use a portable solar system for to charge your batteries while you're operating. Really, there's 4 essential components that you're going to need for solar power. Number 1, of course, is a solar panel. And we'll talk about these in a second. Next would be a charge controller. Next is a storage battery. And finally, sort of an optional piece, but one that's really helpful, is some kind of a power monitor. You can't take a solar panel and hook it up to your device and expect your device to operate. The panels just don't produce enough current for a reliable amount of time to keep your average devices up and running. Nor can you just take a battery and connect it to your solar panel and expect the battery to charge. There needs to be an interface between the two to make sure that the proper amount of voltage goes into the battery to make sure that it stops charging when the battery is full of energy. So really those 3 pieces, the panel, the controller, and the battery, and then your devices connect to the battery, and that's where you sip your solar power when you're using your device. Solar panels come in many different shapes, sizes, powers, strengths. You've got your permanent mount panels. Those are what you're going to see on top of a roof of a building or some other kind of structure. These units can be anywhere from 100 watts per unit to up to 400 watts per unit, and then they're just like building blocks. You just get them ganged up together for larger and larger solar arrays. Portable units, like the ones all the way to the right there, those would be kind of like fold-up portable panels. Usually those will range in power from, say, 100 watts to 200 watts or so. And then flexible panels. You can thin film panels that can go around shapes. I've seen people epoxy those to the roofs of their camper, their trailers and whatnot, where they didn't want one of these rigid panels, something that can conform to the type of surface that you're mounting them on. And the panels, they do have different advantages or disadvantages, but basically they all do basically the same thing. They generate electricity of one way, shape, or form. Next up, your next piece is your charge controller, and your charge controllers come in 2 different flavors. Pulse width modulation, or PWM, and MPPT, or maximum power point tracking. And you'll probably hear people say, does anybody know the difference between a PWM and an MPPT charge controller? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, I think I found the easiest way to kind of explain them. Pulse width modulation, the controller is taking the voltage from the panel and is feeding it to the battery in a series of pulses. And the amount of power it's sending to the battery is regulated by by more and more or less and less pulses. So if the battery needs lots of energy and the controller is getting lots of energy from the sun, it's going to send lots of these little pulses at a constant voltage into the battery. The charge controller switches on and off to vary the output current in order to match the voltage of the battery. And that's the key point. Your pulse width, your solar panel is going to be, in full sun, is going to be generating approximately anywhere from 17 to 19 volts of power. Your battery is going to need to charge, is going to need in the neighborhood of about 14 volts. So the controller is going to match the voltage of the battery, approximately 14-ish volts, and it's going to change the current or the amount of power it sends to the battery in order to charge the battery. Now that's not a very, no, it's kind of an elegant solution, but it's not a very efficient solution. And you can lose up to 30% of your power through pulse width modulated charge controllers.
So why do they use it?
Well, we'll get to that in a second, because that's a very good question. Why do we use a pulse width modulated controller? The second type is your maximum power point tracking controller. And this one is different. It's got more circuitry in it, and basically what it is a DC to DC converter. It's taking the DC energy from the panel and it's changing it to another DC voltage for the battery. The controller uses DC to DC conversion to match the battery voltage in order to maximize current flow to the battery. So, if the panel is generating 19 volts and in full sun, and the battery wants 14-ish volts, the MPPT controller is going to use DC conversion to drop that voltage down to 14-ish volts, whatever. And then when you do that, if you remember Ohm's law, dropping the voltage increases the current, so more current goes into the battery. As we get towards, say, the end of the day, or if the panel is shaded, its voltage may go down. It may generate, so it's going to generate maybe a lower voltage. The MPPT controller can maybe up the voltage slightly or modify or change the voltage so that it's always whatever the panel is giving the controller is always going to try to maximize whatever voltage the battery requires to fully charge. So MPPT controllers are always shifting up and down to find that what's called that maximum power point in order to generate the most energy to the controller at any given time. So moving on, because Dan asked a really good question. Why would we even want a pulse width modulated controller? They're cheap. You can get a PWM controller for like 20 bucks. They're dirt cheap. They're a simple solution. They've been around for a long time and they work. They're actually better for small solar systems. MPPT controllers tend to work best with, if you've got a panel or an array of panels of 170 watts or more, that's where they kind of find their sweet spot and can really generate more power. A downside, your PWM, they operate only at battery voltage, so you're losing some of your efficiency. But a PWM controller is able to float charge a battery. So if you're in a situation, say you got a shed out on the back 40 and you wanted some lights for it, well, you could get a cheap Harbor Freight panel, one of those PWM controllers that come with it, and it'll float your lead acid AGM battery out at the shed, and everything's going to be fine and dandy when you come out there and turn your lights on in October. And finally, PWM controllers don't make RF noise. They're very quiet on the HF bands. And if you're thinking about a solar system for maybe charging batteries for while you are on the air with HF, maybe a PWM system, even though it's not the most efficient, maybe it may be the best for your needs. But on the other hand, MPPT, it's always going to adjust the voltage so it's able to generate more power into the panel or into the battery. It works better in partial shade. So if you're, say, RVing and you're in a campsite that doesn't have the best, or is a full shade or a partial shade site, doesn't have the best access to the sun, you can collect more, and you can use more of that energy that the panel is delivering with an MPPT controller. And also a neat thing with MPPT is because it's always adjusting the voltage, you can actually get away with a smaller gauge power cable. With PWM controllers, you have to maximize wire gauge in order to get the most of that energy from the panel to the controller. With MPPT, because it's always calculating and trying to derive the best voltage out of the panel based on what it's or best current out of the panel based on what the voltage is given it, you can get by with smaller gauge panels. So if your solar array is further away from your battery or your controller, you can use longer wire. You can use longer wire runs with MPPT, or you can use a thinner gauge cable if you've got shorter wire runs. And we'll talk about that in a second too. But the downside can generate RF hash. Now there's some controllers on the market that are quieter than others, and there's some that are really terrible. So Mike.
I've got an Epic Power Gate. It actually has a button on it that you can suspend the charging for like 30 minutes while you're on the radio, so it doesn't send the noise. And you can also turn it off completely.
That's Epic by West Mountain Radio.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a great concept. Basically you're just turning off the controller so it's not doing that DC to DC conversion process. And that's what's generating the noise, is that DC to DC conversion. Joe.
Just one point. If you have a pulse width modulated system and you're ever trying to do like that 3D troubleshooting, you are going to need to have a true RMS meter. A regular multimeter will not handle pulse width modulated current sources. So it's got to be true RMS on it.
Yeah, so if you want to find out the current that's coming out of your pulse width modulated meter, a true RMS meter would be...
The Harbor Freight ain't going to work.
So good, really good thing to point out with the PWM controllers. So, it's not a question of is one always better than the other, because if you go online and you see somebody says, well, I want to put a solar system together for my radio, the first comment that's always going to be seen in that thread is, oh, you want MPPT. But nobody says why you want MPPT controllers. So you may or may not, considering the RF hash that they generate. Or you may want to invest some money in a high quality or commercial grade controller to eliminate the RF hash. It can be done. So, but your $40 Chinese MPPT controller, just forget about it. Storage batteries. Lead acid or AGM batteries for a long time have been the most common type of batteries that we've used for solar systems. They're inexpensive, they're heavy, but a downside of a lead acid battery is that they can only effectively deliver up to about 50% of the rated capacity. So if you've got a 100 amp hour lead acid battery, expect a capacity of maybe about 50 amp hours. And the reason is something that's called the Pukert effect. And the Pukert law, I don't have it memorized, so I'm going to try to explain it the best I can, is that with lead acid batteries, the faster you discharge the battery, the less the battery is able to give up energy. So high discharge rates will actually kind of hobble the battery. They're unable to fully provide that capacity at very high discharge rates. And that's been shown by a German physicist by the name of Pucher. So, and you can if you've got lead acid systems, you know, they're great, they're cheap, they work really well in cold weather environments, but just know that their rated capacities, even though it says maybe 100 amp hours, you're not going to truly get 100 amp hours out of that battery unless you can kind of like trickle discharge it all the way down to, you know, 11 volts. And really you don't want to do that, because once you get that battery down to 12 volt nominal, you know, it's more than 50% consumed, so you need to recharge it. Lithium iron phosphate batteries, on the other hand, have a very high capacity. They're lightweight. They can deliver up to 90% of their rated power capacity, but very hot and very cold conditions can also affect their performance. You can't charge a lithium iron phosphate battery below approximately 30 degrees Fahrenheit. If you do that, it actually destroys the battery chemistry. When you get over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the batteries also experience issues, performance issues. That's when they could actually swell and burst. So very hot or very cold environments may not be the best choice for that type of batteries, but they have a lot of capacity, and you can run them down to next to nothing. The batteries, lithium iron phosphate batteries, have battery management systems in them, circuitry that always check and measure and check and rate the cells as it's discharging and as it's charging, and that BMS, or battery management system, will shut down the battery when it goes down to that terminal voltage. So which battery is the best for you? Well, there again, it depends on what you're looking for in a system. But for the most part, the lithium iron phosphate batteries, even though they're more expensive, you almost make up for the cost of going that route than with the lead acid. You know, for the cost of 200 amp hour lead acid batteries, you're probably more than halfway to the cost of a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery.
So that's significantly more expensive.
They can be. I think that Renogy battery on the bottom there, I think that retails at about $800 for 100 amp hours. And that that Group 27 AGM battery, which is also 100 amp hours, that was approximately, that's a West Marine, I think that was about a $250, about a $300 battery. So, yeah, Mike.
I found one, I think on Amazon, a new company called Zooms.
Yeah.
And $499 for a 100 amp hour battery, or $399.
Yep.
$399 for 100 amp hour, it's incredible.
I've seen some lithium.
Lithium.
There are some dirt cheap Chinese
And they
lithium.
got good reviews.
Yeah, lithium iron phosphate batteries on the market, and they're breaking that $400 barrier for a 100 amp hour battery, which is great.
Yeah,
So
one of the
Gary.
things I did in my solar install in my RV is I've got a pair of Go-Kart 6 volts in series, and you get considerably more amperage than you do with a single 12.
Yes.
And that extends the life of use, you know, the practical day-to-day life of use a lot, at least in my experience.
And part of the reason is also because of the Puchert effect, because now you're sharing, even though they're in series for a 12 volt system, you've got two separate cells, so you've got a higher rated capacity.
So it's kind of in the middle between the two of them.
Yeah, and that's a really good thing to think about. And I mean, we can even talk about 24 volt systems, but that's a whole nother ball game. So we'll stay with the 12 volt system. So, did I see another question?
Do you know if storing them, are they being stored in a cold environment with a stored battery? Or, I mean, can it be stored at 20 degrees and as long as you don't charge it, you fine? Or is that going to damage the battery?
No, it's not. No, cold weather is not going to damage lithium iron phosphate batteries. They will slowly discharge. They'll probably slowly discharge a little faster in a cold environment. but even if they're discharged, you can usually charge them and, warm them up and bring them back into charge. Unlike lead acid batteries, you know, once they get into deep discharge, then it's like a world of hurt to get them going again.
Another thing is, the lithium batteries hold their charge.
Yes, they do.
don't self-discharge. I've had one for almost a year, and it didn't drop more than 0.2 of a volt over that year period sitting.
Yep, I've overwintered batteries, and after several months, you know, you put them on the charger, and it takes maybe like a half hour or so just to get them back up to. That's which is a nice thing about lithium batteries is that there's no, you know, when you charge them, there's no absorption phase. You can just go, you know, with a lead acid battery, you got to give them that absorptive charge to kind of get them going to accept a higher charge rate. With lithium iron, you can just dump current, and they'll just take it, and then when they're done, you know, when they're full, the BMS will shut them off. All right, power monitors. Not really, you know, these aren't necessary, but I think they're very helpful for your solar system because you really want to know what you're putting into the battery and what you're taking out of it. Because once you've got that knowledge of what your consumption rates are and what your capabilities are of your panel and your charge controller, then you can make more intelligent decisions like, is my system sized correctly or not? Up on the top, this is just a cheap little sub $20 monitor. When I'm using a portable battery out in the field on the air, I've got one of those connected so I can watch what my voltage and how many watt hours I've consumed. For the trailer, on the other hand, I've got this one on the bottom. That's called the Victron Energy's Smart Shunt, and that goes onto the negative power lead, and it measures everything that passes through the battery. So I know what's charging and how much is charging and what's discharging, and it can kind of keep track of that using just a little app on the phone.
Is that one Bluetooth, Michael?
Yeah, that one's
Yeah.
Bluetooth. The Smart Shunt is Bluetooth. And they actually make, if you don't want to go the Bluetooth route, they do make versions that have a display that you can mount somewhere. In my little trailer, the Bluetooth one is nice because I don't have the space. So I just pull up the phone and...
One of the nice things for your camping or
Yeah.
RVing is on your app, it just
Yeah.
tells me how much time I have.
Yes.
I got 10 days of battery at the present usage. It's really nice.
I'll show you that display in a second too, so you can kind of get, Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the my solar setup, because I've kind of really, like Joe said, I've really gone down the rabbit hole with this thing. So this spring, I added on the roof, you can kind of see it here, right above the awning, is a 180 watt rigid solar panel. It's mounted to the roof rack on rails and the whole 9 yards. And then the power cable comes down here, enters into the body of the trailer through underneath the mattress. Everything's all covered up in conduit, split loom and whatnot, into the battery and the charge controller that's in the back of the back. Now I found that when we first started out in the spring, everything was working great. You know, there weren't a lot of leaves on the trees, so we had no problem getting sun. Everything stayed charged up. As we moved into summer, and I found more camping spots that were fully shaded, all of a sudden, you know, I'm having a harder and harder time generating enough power because one of my needs is I have a compressor style refrigerator in the back of the camper, and in a hot summer day, it's consuming up to 22 amp hours of power per day, especially if we're in the 80 degree days or something like that. So I added a second panel. This is a 100 watt Renogy panel. I've had this for a couple of years, and that's the panel I've always used for charging my lithium batteries when I was on the air. It had a little pulse width modulator charge controller on the back. I removed that and hooked up about 25 feet of 12 gauge wire, and I got a splitter right here, so I can hook that panel in parallel with the second panel. Now, as long as even though they're two different brands of panels, as long as you can have as long as the panels are matched close enough in their operating voltage, you know, if you look on the back of the panel, there's two voltages, the open circuit, and then what's considered the operating voltage, and the operating voltage is usually around 18 or 19 volts. These two panels were within 0.3 volts of each other, which was good enough for the charge controller to gang those together. So now I've got 280 watts of power, and since I got this on 25 feet of line, I can move it around and try to catch the sun as it passes through the day. And it really made a difference. I may have been able to make up some of those losses. In the back end, charge controller. This is a specialty one. DIY Solar for You is a guy out of Michigan, and he makes these custom, he's also a ham. He makes these MPPT charge controllers that are highly RF resistant. This thing does not make noise at all. In fact, it even comes with a choke so that you can keep any RF radiation from coming off this is the line that comes from the panel into the charge controller. And they're quiet, they're very quiet. I've operated next to the trailer and I haven't picked up any RF hash at all. The battery's in this box. It's a 50 amp hour battery. Probably a little bit small for my needs, but the galley space is tight. So by next year, I'm gonna try to figure out how I can get 100 amp hours of power in the trailer. Distribution box, and then this is that smart shunt. And I just have a piece of rubber bicycle tire that protects those negative terminals so nothing can accidentally bump across it. Not that it's going to cause a problem with the negative power leads, but just an extra bit of safety. So that's pretty much the system. That's, there's the refrigerator right next door, and when it's got a little 12-volt compressor. It'll consume about 25 watts, when it's running, and it runs for up to about a 20-minute cycle. And it'll cycle on and then it'll off for maybe 40 minutes or an hour, depending on what the ambient temperature is and how much it can kind of, shed warm air, just like any other type of refrigerator. So it's relatively efficient, but still, if it's a hot day and it takes a significant amount of power. And then finally, this is the app we were talking about. This is the Smart Shunt app. If you see here, this is the display for my charge controller. Right now I'm collecting 1.53 amps of power from the panel. It was kind of it was a cloudy day, so there was no direct sun hitting the panel. My battery's 100% charged, but if you look under current, you probably can't see this, but it says negative 0.53 amps. So I'm consuming a half amp of power. Now I know that even though I'm generating 1.5 amps, I'm losing a half amp because the refrigerator kicked in and it's sucking up 2 amps of power. So that's what then time remaining, if I stay on that course, it'll run that way for 3 days, but give or take. Time remaining isn't as useful as the state of charge percentage here. That tells you how much juice overall is left in your battery, so you could kind of guesstimate how long things are going to run. But knowing how much I'm producing and how much I'm consuming gives me that knowledge on what my overall solar system is doing, and then how I can make my system either more efficient or generate more power or store more power. And that's basically, that's basically what, your only options with a solar system. You either add more batteries, or you add more panels, or you come up with some way to make what you've got more efficient. If you're a stationary, panels are cheap, $1 a watt. So adding more panels might be your best bet. If you're in a situation where, you've got limited space for panels, then investing in more batteries so you can stretch out your storage capabilities might be the answer. With that is the end of my presentation. I got some resources here. Feel free to come up here with your phone and take a picture of that. Or I can email this presentation too, it's kind of big. So the buck boost charge controller, DIY solar for you. Victron Energy, that's the company that makes the smart shunt, and they've got a really nice website with a lot of technical documents on there if you want to learn more about these things. There's a YouTube channel, DIY Solar with Will Prowse. This guy is like a solar savant, just an amateur that's really into solar power. I recommend you check out his stuff. He does teardowns of cheap $400 batteries.
That's the guy that got me to the Zooms battery.
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
He's really good.
and then there's another guy that's into the DIY mobile solar called a YouTube channel by the name of Hobo Tech. He has a lot of product reviews. So if you're looking for panels or things of that nature, battery systems, he's a good one to check out too.
Cool information.
All right. That's all I got.
Thank you.
For those who want minutes of tonight, including the souvenir photo of our presenter, they're right here.
Well, I hope you found that interesting. And at the end of the presentation, I did have about 15 minutes worth of question and answer that I left out of this video, but will be available as a bonus video for my patrons. If you're interested in that, check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/KB9VBR Antennas. And that's where you'll find other exclusive content like the question and answer session that came out of this presentation. But for more articles and information, be sure to check out my blog at www.jpol-antenna.com. Your support of this channel drives the production of future videos. Like and subscribe is your best way to be notified when future videos are released. And that's it for this time. Have a great day. I'm Michael, KB9VBR 73.